Our next featured speaker is Dr. Charles Caillouet. And Charles retired from the NOAA Fisheries Service at the Galveston Laboratory in Texas in 1998. His research focuses were Panaic shrimp mariculture and stock assessment, and KEMP'S Ridley sea turtle population recovery. He remains engaged in these topics as a marine fisheries scientist and conservation volunteer. And he actually provided me with a lot of input on my recent extension publication, so thank you, Charles. A wonderful resource. He is a member of the IUCN Marine Turtle Specialist Group and a fellow emeritus of the American Institute of Fishery Research Biologists. Since retirement, he served on ad hoc shrimp effort working groups, Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Shrimp Advisory Committee, and Texas Sea Grants Advisory Committee. He participated in the development of the KEMP'S Ridley Stock Assessment Model and peer-reviewed drafts of the binational KEMP'S Ridley Recovery Plan and 5-year review. He received his PhD in fishery biology from Iowa State University. And our fun fact for Charles, he's very talented. He is a musician. He is an artist. He works in oil, acrylics, watercolor, pen and ink, and my favorite, he's a ceramic artist and potter as well, a wood sculptor. His focus, I think, is mostly on nature, shorebirds, ducks, geese, decoys, but he's also, I think, created some sea turtle sculptures as well that he donated. Yeah? Well, you can come up and explain all your talents, but anyway, please welcome Charles.
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me, and also the Sea Grant, Texas Sea Grant Program. And also thanks to Pat Birchfield and Amy Pena, who I've worked with over the years. And also because I am going to cover some information that some of my colleagues participated in. I'd like to recognize Benny Galloway, Nathan Putman, Donna Shaver, and I guess that's about good enough for now. Now I'm going to be looking at the screen here, so don't get the impression I don't know what's going on up there. I'm going to talk about KEMP'S Ridley sea turtles today, and I'll be focusing on the adults and also the subadults, which are large, immature KEMP'S Ridleys. And of course, they all eventually come from hatchlings, and the data we have on hatchlings includes both a combination of male and female. We don't distinguish them in the analyses we've done. KEMP'S Ridley is a single species, endangered throughout its range. Its range includes the Gulf of Mexico and the North Atlantic Ocean. This species is somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 million years old, so it's worth preserving. It's been around for a while, and of course its demise is largely because of human impacts. Am I talking on the wrong? Okay. The sex ratios are female dominated.
Don't mind me.
Okay. And KEMP'S Ridley happens to be Texas's official sea turtle, for those of you who may not know that. I won't cover this sea turtle life cycle because it's been very adequately covered before. Most KEMP'S Ridleys remain in the Gulf of Mexico. The word that was used earlier is retentive. Some of them obviously escape to the North Atlantic, and they're carried there passively, more or less, by oceanic currents. I'm going to make a wild hypothesis today that the KEMP'S Ridleys in the North Atlantic Ocean contribute much less to population recovery than those that remain in the Gulf of Mexico. These are some of the reasons I'll mention. Fewer enter the North Atlantic to begin with. Numbers decline both in the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. They grow slower in the Atlantic than they do in the Gulf of Mexico, and they mature later on than they do. They mature later in the Atlantic than they do in the Gulf of Mexico. Nestings are very rare on the Atlantic coast. Mark recapture evidence is very, very limited. I think the number is something like 20 recaptures of turtles in the Gulf of Mexico that had been tagged in the Atlantic, and all of those, I believe, were nesting at Rancho Nuevo and Tamaulipas. If you know of more mark recapture information than this, please let me know, because I'm curious about it. The migration distances would obviously be much longer coming from the Atlantic into the Gulf of Mexico to western Gulf beaches for nesting than it would be if the turtles started within the Gulf of Mexico. We need to know what the major causes of Kemp's Ridley nesting setback in 2010 is. It hasn't actually been identified with certainty. There are a lot of theories about what happened, but basically the nesting in Tamaulipas, which is our index area for the population size, dropped about 35 or more %. So this is a very significant drop. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill damage assessment stated that Deepwater oil was unlikely to have had a direct impact on Kemp's Ridley nesting in 2010. It might have had an indirect impact, or the mitigation, which included dispersants, included cold Mississippi River water being used to kind of push back the oil spill from the coast, and burning of oil, a number of those things that could have impacted the turtles that would have nested in 2010. We need to identify the major causes or cause of the setback in 2010, because if it wasn't the oil spill, we need some more sensitive techniques to detect what causes nesting setbacks in sea turtles. The oil spill occurred in what we can call the adult and subadult Ridley feeding grounds. These are white shrimp and fortunate or swimming crab habitats in Louisiana, and also the Mississippi River Delta, and this would be an area, it would include also the area down to Tabasco and Campeche. This area where the oil spill occurred, mostly in Louisiana and over near Mississippi, was called the Fertile Fisheries Crescent back in 1963 by Gordon Gunter. And that's because it was identified as one of the most highly productive areas in the world for fisheries, etc. Swimming crabs, like blue crab, are primary prey for Kemp's Ridley sea turtle. And the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and mitigation occurred within this same feeding grounds area, and again for adult and subadult Kemp's Ridleys. I emphasize that because these are the only life stages that could have affected nesting in 2010 and beyond. This is my adopted population growth curve tutorial. This doesn't show up on there. Okay. This is considered the lag stage in population growth, and this is a generalized population growth curve. Kemp's Ridley was near the very lowest part in 1963 when the Tamaulipas nesting ground was discovered, and 1961. And then following that, the population grows exponentially for a time and then reaches an inflection point somewhere around in here, and the rate of population growth declines until it practically reaches zero. And this is influenced by the carrying capacity of the environment for KEMP'S Ridleys. I added this little item here. This is where the oil spill, this is the oil spill site. Nathan Putman put together this visual for me. It's very nice. This box is repeated larger down here. This is the KEMP'S Ridley index for the female population. The index itself is annual numbers of nests. And that's on the index beach in Tamaulipas. You can see it expanded here. This is Rancho Nuevo. That's the epicenter of nesting for KEMP'S Ridley. And most of the modeling that has been done using hatchlings and nests of KEMP'S Ridley has used numbers from this specific area. Now, the KEMP'S Ridley nests in Texas, it nests in Veracruz, it nests sporadically in other parts of the Gulf and rarely on the East Coast. But modelers have decided to use a particular specific zone for following the data over the years. There were 40 to 42,000 estimated KEMP'S Ridleys that nested on one day in June 1947. They nest in an arribada, which is an arrival from sea. And this is just a picture. This is a drawing from a frame in the Andres Herrera film that was made in 1947. KEMP'S Ridley conservation efforts have been ongoing for 50 years. So we know a lot about KEMP'S Ridley, the KEMP'S Ridley population and the trend over the years. The conservation efforts focus primarily on reducing deaths of nesters, eggs, and hatchlings on Gulf of Mexico nesting beaches and reducing deaths of neritic life stage turtles at sea. I think I'll skip this series to save time, but there have been a number of conservation efforts and developments over the years, beginning in 1963. Most of the work was done in Mexico initially. In 1974, Mexico gradually excluded U.S. shrimpers from their most productive shrimping grounds. That certainly must have reduced some of the mortality on KEMP'S Ridleys. And there was a treaty in 1976 that gradually phased out all U.S. fleet shrimping in Mexico's waters. That certainly reduced the pressure on KEMP'S Ridleys as well. Another important aspect is that the KEMP'S Ridley Restoration and Enhancement Program, which is a binational program that will be talked about later on by other speakers, started in 1978. There were some other events that reduced the pressure on KEMP'S Ridley from the shrimping industry beyond that. Now, this is one of the most important slides I have today. It shows what happened between 1966, when protection of the nesting beach in Tamaulipas began, and 1985, which was the lowest point for the KEMP'S Ridley nest numbers historically, apart from what had taken place before that. The point I want to make here is that this was the population of old nesters, meaning those are the ones that were produced from hatchlings well before conservation began. And the new nesters, which would have been nesters that resulted from these conservation efforts that started in 1966 did not start appearing in Tamaulipas until 1976. This information, although it's been published, and it's been, the data itself was published by Rene Marquez in 1994, and it's been available in this graph. It's largely ignored when people talk about what factors are affecting Kemp's release or have affected their restoration and beginning of recovery. So notice that these went to zero, these residual nesters went to zero in 1984. They had disappeared completely from the nesting beach. However, the young nesters, the new nesters produced from the conservation efforts began showing up and increased in numbers thereafter. And then I have right here all of the nesters beyond 1985 were young. These are graphs of shrimping effort trends over the years. And I'll show you one for each of the three major species: brown shrimp, brown, white, and pink shrimp. This is only U.S. fleet, so we don't have information on shrimping effort by the Mexican fleet in Mexico's waters. We do have some for U.S. fleet in Mexico's waters, but that was phased out, as I pointed out. You can see from these graphs that there's generally a very severe drop in more recent years of shrimping effort. This is the shrimping effort graph axis here, and the red is the shrimping effort. The drop is not as drastic for white shrimp, but it is sharp at this point, but it's very low here and then reaches the peak and then goes down. But in recent years, it's down. And then for pink shrimp, the same is true, very precipitous. So the point is, the shrimping industry has declined and shrimping effort has declined dramatically. And that had a big influence on the exponential growth of the population, as well as the use of turtle excluder devices. Now this slide is shown in logarithmic scale because I could not put the numbers of hatchlings on this graph and the numbers of nests because they're so much different. I mean, these are up in the hundreds of thousands. This line here is what it has been established as one of the recovery criteria within the binational recovery plan. That criterion is 25,000 nests nesting in a season. You can see that it was rapidly approaching that. The population was, based on annual nests, was rapidly approaching that limit in 2009, and then there was the drop in 2010. It popped up a bit after that, and these are the last 2 years, 2015 and 16, that I've added to this graph. This graph up here, this line up here is the established level of minimum level of hatchling production in Tamaulipas that the binational recovery plan requires. And you can see it has been above that since around 2000, except for a little drop in 2001, I think it is. And you can also see that it is going down generally, but varying. And that's a function of the leveling out at more or less of nests each year since the oil spill. I must emphasize that when we're looking at what happened in 2010 to nesting and the years beyond, we should be looking at what's happened to adult females, because they're the only ones that nest, and also those that would have matured between the nesting seasons in 2009 and 2010. That happened to be immature but large Kemp's ridleys at the time. Exponential growth in the annual nest at the index beach basically stopped in 2010. Whatever stopped that exponential growth occurred between 2009 and ends of 2009 and 2010 nesting seasons. It reduced the numbers of adult females and large immature females that otherwise would have matured. It affected the age structure of the population and population momentum. Population momentum is what occurs, for example, if all of a sudden inputs of hatchlings are stopped. The population will continue to grow for a number of years, simply because you have all of these age groups or cohorts within a multi-age population that will eventually mature and contribute to the next generation and so forth. Well, the fact that we had a drop in nesting shows that the population momentum was affected, because even though a lot of young turtles were killed by the oil spill, those would not have contributed to nesting and nest until many years later. Here are some fundamental concepts. The setback in annual nest resulted in a setback of annual hatchlings released. We've shown that in the graph. Kemp's ridley population growth occurs when births exceed deaths and or immigration exceeds emigration. Immigration and emigration can be ignored because the data are available for the entire population. Reversal of the pre-1986 decline in annual nests suggests that cumulative conservation efforts, which increased cumulative releases of hatchlings, and also reduced deaths at sea, increased the annual numbers of adult females in the population. And this occurred before any TED regulations. A more important fundamental concept as far as 2010 is concerned is exponential growth in nests prior to 2010 could not possibly have taken place unless all sources of natural and human-caused mortality overwhelmed were overwhelmed by conservation efforts and reduction of deaths at sea. This graph shows again the established criterion for downlisting of Kemp's ridleys at 25,000 nests per season. This is the line that one could generate from the prediction by NMFS that the population would have continued to grow at 19% per year had mortality stayed the same and other factors stayed the same. Well, obviously they didn't stay the same, because what has been observed is the drop in 2010. Again, a little bit of an increase there, comes down and goes back. So we're having variations now, but clearly the difference between what is being observed is getting bigger and bigger if you compare it to the difference between observed and predicted is getting bigger. So what has happened is the population has definitely been set back, and in a large way. These are strandings of Kemp's ridleys in the northern Gulf, or maybe in the entire Gulf, the entire northern Gulf, not necessarily just in the impact area. This is 2009, and you see the size distribution has two peaks in it. These would be what you would call juveniles, young juveniles, but not the early stage. The earliest stage would be down here. And then you get a little peak here, which represents the subadults and adults. And you see that the very largest of these is low. Now, I got this graph from another publication, and I had to extend this because it was shown on the same size here, but the axes show different numbers. These go from 0 to 30, and this one goes from 0 to 300. So this makes the numbers in those 2 years comparable. And again, this is very similar in terms of what was killed in 2009 and showed up as strandings, and what was killed in 2010. But you notice this little peak here, that's subadult probably. It's well depressed here. And so the population momentum will be coming from if this represents the turtles in the population, these are the size classes that would be maturing and showing up later on. Apparently they're not showing up. My colleagues Nathan Putman and Benny Galloway contributed to this particular paper, and it's based on assuming a minimum age of maturity for Kemp's ridleys at 10 years. This is really important, and this comes from that Marquez data for the 1966 through 1985 period. What we did that was different from any other previous modeling was, instead of trying to relate time-lagged annual nests to annual hatchling releases, we cumulated hatchling releases. We stacked them up, starting with 1966, and each year we would add the next year's data to it, and so you get a nice smooth exponential curve. Except maybe in the last years or before the oil spill, you see a little bit slowing of that increase. So it may have been taking on an S shape like a typical growth curve. And what we did is we plotted, in this case, the time-lagged annual nest, in other words, time-lagged by 10 years, against the cumulative hatchling releases. And you see this increases exponentially for a number of years up to 2009, although there is a little bit of slowing shown here, which may mean it was now past the inflection point. But had nothing happened that was out of the ordinary, this would have continued growing up, because we had all this huge accumulation of all size classes, age classes taking place. So anyway, it dropped, and you can see that it's not doing well. It's a general downward trend, but in the last 2 years we've gotten an increase. In this case, we plotted time-lagged annual nests divided by cumulative hatchling releases. And it's got a similar shape to it, but a much more dramatic drop. In other words, the population is not behaving as you would expect it to be behaving if nothing catastrophic had happened. This is a graph of hatchlings produced per nest, and since 1989 it's been decreasing. There are a number of possible hypotheses about why it's decreasing, But the important take-home message here is that this is going to make it all the more difficult for conservation efforts to reverse this huge drop in stabilization of the population. One of the problems might have to do with the condition of the females and the subadults in terms of their health and ability to produce eggs and migrate to nesting beaches. So just take a look at those various things because I'm running out of time. Research needs. We need to add to our modeling efforts the annual shrimp trawling effort by Mexico's fleet. This information has not been available to us for modeling, and so we don't know what impact Mexico's fleet might be having on the Kemp's Ridley population. We need to examine and determine causes of annual strandings near nesting beaches in Veracruz and Tamaulipas and off of Padre Island National Seashore or generally in Texas, because if there is something causing high mortality in adults and subadults, this is going to have effects on nesting. We need to continue examining other factors that affect migrations. We need to estimate the annual proportions of neophyte nesters, remigration, and intervals of the nesters, and develop long-term tag for mass tagging hatchlings. Unless we can follow what goes on in the population from the hatchlings forward, we are going to have a whole lot of difficulty determining what we can do to remedy this stabilization in the population. Probably need to wrap it up so we can skip through this. Conclusions are that shrimp trawling in the U.S. fleet, by the U.S. fleet, was not the major cause of the setback in Kemp's Ridley nesting in 2010 or the years thereafter. I think we can safely say that because shrimping has declined. We are using TEDs, and TED compliance is good and improving. So we need to look to something else as a major cause. I'm not saying that shrimping with TEDs had no effect in those years, but it probably was not the major cause. And there remains a need to identify the major cause. Post-2009 nesting and hatchling release setback and the post-1989 decline in annual hatchlings per nest will likely further delay resumption of exponential growth, and I should add recovery of the Kemp's Ridley population. We need to keep doing more of what we've been doing so far. I think maybe this is probably going to be the biggest challenge right here, is to assure funding for all of these efforts. I'm going to make another plea. This is one of my favorite arguments, is that government agencies need to post all of the data, especially for nests and hatchlings, online on an updated basis so that people other than people in the government can analyze the data and come up with different opinions about what is going on. Thank you very much.